Tonight on CBC Vancouver News.
This is apocalyptic, but it's an optional apocalypse.
Worsening wildfires, flooding, and drought. The UN warns of irreversible climate catastrophes if we do not curb emissions. The impact on BC and Canada.
All I want is just to see him one more time, and he's never coming back.
A young BC father died of flesh-eating disease. Now his widow is suing health authorities, claiming doctors misdiagnosed him numerous times.
I believe the world is on our side.
We will be supplying Ukraine with anti-tank weapons systems and upgraded ammunition.
And Canada is sending more weapons to Ukraine. The impact amid the violence.
This is CBC Vancouver News.
Good evening, I'm Dan Burwood. Anita is off tonight. We're going to have the latest for you on the Russian invasion of Ukraine a little later in the broadcast. But first, we've heard the warnings before. Now, climate change experts around the world warn of irreversible global catastrophes if more action is not taken now. Our John Hernandez reports BC is on the front lines of the climate crisis.
From wildfires to heat domes to catastrophic flooding. You could call it a year of climate catastrophe in BC, one that aligns with projections released today by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
The impacts of climate change are happening now. They're happening faster than was reported in our last assessment in 2014.
Like in much of the world, authors say Canada is due for an onslaught of climate challenges, a list that includes hotter and longer wildfire seasons, increased rainfall, flooding, and landslides, all of which will contribute to the destruction of ecosystems and key infrastructure. Predictions that came true in BC this past year after the report was initially drafted.
And it just shows that the climate is changing faster in a way than scientists can even assess it, which is sort of what makes doing this so challenging.
The IPCC says the window to prevent future disasters is closing. The gravity of the report not lost on provincial leaders.
British Columbia has joined those jurisdictions around the world that are on the front line of the climate crisis and are feeling the impacts in very profound ways. While the province has committed upwards of $2 billion towards its climate strategy in its most recent budgets, experts say policy changes need to happen now.
This is apocalyptic, but it's an optional apocalypse. And it is entirely dependent on what policies our governments choose. And we need to pressure them to make the right choices.
This conservation scientist says the answer is relatively simple. Eliminate fossil fuels in as many ways as possible, including in our cars and in our homes.
That might mean installing heat pumps instead of natural gas in people's homes. A heat pump in every home is something that we should absolutely do and could reduce our natural gas use almost immediately. This is not complicated stuff, but it's stuff that you need the policies to work together to make it happen.
The UN panel's next report is due out in just a few months, outlining ways to cut emissions before it's too late. John Hernandez, CBC News, Vancouver.
Meteorologist Johanna Wagstaffe joins us now with the forecast. Joe, before we get to that, scary predictions from yet another UN climate report. Optional apocalypse. It's another sobering, if not frightening, picture.
Yeah, bleak is the word really being used to describe that report. Bleak, but tinged with hope. As John mentioned, that window still there, but closing quickly. And I'm looking forward to telling you more about the science behind this report, how it came together a little bit later on in the show. But first, the science behind a very wet start to the week. It's a very typical spring-like pattern that we're getting into that we first saw over the weekend. A southwesterly push is bringing system after system to the coast. 8 right now at YVR, and we will see afternoon highs hit the double digits over the next few days. You can see earlier today some yellows in the radar. That's the heavier downpours. Rainfall warnings have actually just ended for Metro Vancouver, seeing totals between 50 and 70 millimeters still in place up towards Nanaimo on the island and the Fraser Valley. We've still got some heavier rounds in the next few hours. And notice the red in the interior, the mountain passes under winter storm warnings as the southwesterly flow pushes moisture through the interior. That will be translating to continued heavy snow. We've been seeing it on the Coquihalla through the day, and as we head out towards Allison Pass, we're looking at 50 centimeters of snow. So very much an active weather pattern. But Dan, I also have a very spring-like pattern. We'll see if March is more lion or lamb-like coming up.
Weather update brought to you by Alegria by Cirque du Soleil. Opens March 25th at Concord Pacific Place.
Clean BC programs.
We're investing $1.2 billion in new funding across all sectors, building on the $2.3 billion that have already been budgeted in the past to implement our Clean BC programs. That includes investments in transportation, in new technologies, and particularly to support communities around British Columbia.
The government says the money pledged to it includes $10 million for projects to divert plastic waste and reduce emissions from landfills, vehicle rebates totaling nearly $250 million meant to make it easier for people to switch to electric cars, and $310 million meant to help businesses decarbonize. A house in Nanaimo has been obliterated, several people hurt, and a neighboring neighborhood left literally shaken. At 8:20 last night, an explosion blew up a Pine Street home in Nanaimo. The blast sent debris across the road and shattered windows of nearby houses. The explosion knocked down a power line briefly, interrupting phone service at Nanaimo's RCMP detachment. Several people, some in their homes, suffered minor injuries.
This big, huge, like jumbo jet sounding boom went off, and we were on the living room floor. It was raining in my kitchen because all three skylights have been blown off.
Nanaimo Mounties say the house was believed to be empty, but emergency crews are still on site as they sort through all that rubble. An assault on a security guard at UBC Okanagan has now turned into a homicide investigation. On Saturday morning, the RCMP responded to an attack on a security guard on campus. The 24-year-old woman has now died from her injuries. Police arrested a suspect shortly after under the Mental Health Act. They say he remains in hospital and is facing possible murder charges. It may come as no surprise to you that BC's real estate market is still red hot. And if you're a buyer, it may seem impossible to get your foot in the door. The BC Real Estate Association now has dozens of recommendations for the government to protect consumers and help cool the hot market. But as Joel Ballard reports, the province says it has a plan of its own.
Multiple offers, subject-free bids, and properties selling far over asking. It's the norm in BC's housing market.
We're in a crisis of supply.
Experts say there simply isn't enough housing to go around.
The root cause of these stresses and rising housing prices is the mismatch between supply and demand.
The BC Real Estate Association says that last March, there were 67,000 buyers competing for 24,000 listings. And because the market is so hot, prospective buyers feel forced to submit offers without due diligence just to have a fighting chance at being accepted. Well, today, the association announced it has submitted a report to the province with sweeping recommendations, more than 30, to help cool the market and protect consumers. Chief among them is a pre-offer period, where buyers won't be allowed to submit offers until 5 days after the property is listed.
This pre-offer period would give prospective buyers time to view the property, review critical documents, arrange for home inspection, understand any insurance issues, and ensure that their financing is in place.
It would essentially replace the province's proposed cooling period, which, if approved, would allow buyers to back out of a deal without consequences. A policy some experts say would leave the market open to manipulation.
What stops me from going to a neighborhood as a buyer or as a seller and placing an offer on every home, and then choosing which one to buy later on.
If approved, he predicts it could even increase housing prices, while a pre-offer period would be a more balanced approach.
It does not really put anyone at a particular advantage or disadvantage. It It just removes some of the stress of the whole process.
In Victoria, the province showed no intention of scrapping its cooling off period.
You know, I've certainly heard from the realtors and their concerns.
BC's finance minister says the government is still weighing its options.
That's why we asked the BCFSA to do the research to provide us with an analysis about how to best move forward.
The province plans to introduce the legislation this spring. Joel Ballard, CBC News, Vancouver.
The Seychelles First Nation has begun the difficult task of searching a former residential school for unmarked graves and ancestral remains. St. Augustine's Indian Residential School in Seychelles ran from 1904 to 1975. Members from more than 50 First Nations were forced to attend that school. The nation's chief says their focus will be on supporting survivors and community members as they carry out that work. A man has now been charged with numerous offenses after a terrifying crime spree in Vancouver. The suspect allegedly attacked at least 5 women on Saturday, even running after 2 of them into an apartment building as they tried to hide. CBC News spoke with a tenant who was there.
The guy went running down the hall, kicked in the window, came running back. He apparently kicked in the door over here. 2 girls were coming out. He chased them. He picked up sharded glass. He was chasing them, saying, "I'm gonna kill you. I'm gonna kill you." I feel horrible. I feel very violated. Yeah.
McDonald's saw police arrest the man outside her building. Police say he grabbed a woman by the hair outside and punched her. He then banged on the window of another woman's car while making shooting gestures and trying to open the door. The 40-minute spree happened on West 10th Avenue near Oak Street.
These were unprovoked attacks. They would have been terrifying for these victims, absolutely terrifying. We are engaged, our victim services is engaged with them right now, as one could imagine how awful this would be and the trauma that they are left with.
The charges laid against 38-year-old Cole Martin include assault with a weapon, assaulting a police officer, and uttering threats. Police say he appeared to only target women. There is a psychedelic drug that could help improve the quality of life for some terminal cancer patients. Psilocybin, a compound found in magic mushrooms, helps end-of-life patients feel less anxious. But as Carolyn Bargout from the Go Public team tells us, the drug is illegal in this country, even for medical use.
Janice Hughes has had a long journey. 10 years ago, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. In January, the 65-year-old Winnipegger was given 2 years to live.
It makes one desperate. So much to be done.
Hughes is afraid of dying, but doesn't want to be. Studies have shown psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, helps to ease the anxiety in end-of-life patients.
It allows people to have a more comfortable process, to feel more positive.
Psilocybin is illegal in Canada. But since 2020, Health Canada has granted 79 patient exemptions for medical purposes. Hughes requested one, but the government said no.
I don't understand why.
Health Canada had changed the rules. As of January 5th, patients won't get an exemption unless they can show they've exhausted all other legal options, like getting their doctor to apply on their behalf. But Hughes's doctor won't do it.
The new rules require a physician to fill out a complicated application form that asks for the results of psilocybin studies and other clinical data. The doctor must also take full responsibility. They must administer the drug and report to the government how the patient responded to it.
It's a high bar, and this palliative doctor believes this new system is a roadblock to access.
We have an effective and durable treatment. We are withholding that from patients and allowing them to suffer, which I think is unethical.
Health Canada won't comment on specific exemption requests. A spokesperson told Go Public further research is still needed.
I have beautiful nieces and nephews that I want to spend time with. I'm going to start sobbing. I'm not ready to go.
Hughes is hoping the government reverses its decision, so that she and others facing the end of their lives will find a little peace before they go. Caroline Bargout, CBC News, Winnipeg.
The escalating conflict in Ukraine has hit home in BC in all sorts of ways. Now the World Curling Federation is expected to boot Russia's team from an upcoming championship tournament in Prince George. The WCF amended its rules today, giving themselves the power to remove a team if its presence would damage the event or introduce safety or scheduling concerns. And the expectation is they will use that new power to keep the Russians from competing in the late March Women's World Championship Tournament. Member associations have 3 days to voice their objections to the rule change, which Curling Canada is strongly endorsing. Those changes come amid more backlash against Russia in the world of sports. Some major global sports organizations are also banning Russia from competition over its invasion of Ukraine. In a joint statement, the world's two leading soccer bodies said that all Russian teams shall be suspended from both FIFA and UEFA competitions until further notice. Meanwhile, the International Ice Hockey Federation has suspended both Russia and Belarus and pulled the 2023 World Junior Championship from Russia. And there is a live shot of Kyiv tonight, where it is very early in the morning. Where last week we saw lights in a city of about 3 million, tonight it is dark. A city under siege as more and more Russian troops bear down on that city and country. The latest on the invasion after this. Hello to everyone watching our commercial-free live stream. Thanks for staying with us. A charter flight touched down in Gander, Newfoundland this week, carrying a special pack of passengers. 35 dogs en route to their forever homes. It was a bit of a rough journey, though, as Garrett Barrett explains.
Meet Freya, a 10-week-old husky mix who's finally got some space of her own. Her journey to this SPCA was a long one. This weekend, her foster mom loaded her up for her flight from Goose Bay to Gander.
I've been doing this for well over 20 years, and I have to say that Freya was one of the largest puppies I think I've ever had.
That's an incredible thing. Born to a stray dog, volunteers think Freya may be the only one of her litter to survive.
The owners of the mother dog knew that the litter was under the shed, but had a hard time getting underneath it with all of the snow and the ice and everything. So they finally got enough room that one of the kids could get underneath the shed and get her out. Unfortunately, some of her litter mates probably didn't make it out.
It's left her a bit shy, but now she's a hit. The phone's been ringing off the hook with suitors calling for her and the 14 other dogs who arrived in Gander.
I actually have over 30 messages on my phone this morning, and I just have not had a chance to return their calls.
All these puppies will get a good shot at a good home.
It's exciting, especially since we haven't had this in years.
Thanks to a collaboration between SPCAs in this province, dogs have moved from Labrador to Newfoundland before, but never on a private chartered plane.
We're way over capacity, and we've been having a hard time moving them lately with regular flights.
That's how busy it has been. Since January, the SPCA has been taking in more than one animal each day.
Adoption process can take a while when you're processing applications, and we simply cannot, with the amount of animals we have coming in constantly, we simply cannot humanly keep up with the application process.
So it was off to Gander and St. John's, where the waiting list for adoptions is long. Soon they'll be on the move again to permanent homes. But for now, these puppies are catching up on vaccines, checkups, and getting a bit of sleep. Garrett Perry, CBC News, Gander.
Russian and Ukrainian negotiators met for talks at the Belarus border today. Both sides left without an agreement to end the conflict. As Margaret Evans explains, lives are being upended for people still in Ukraine's capital.
Residents of the Ukrainian capital venturing out this morning after a 2-day curfew, but only gingerly. Many spent those days in crowded emergency shelters like the underground.
Now I feel very good because I finally see the sun.
We are stuck in our flat with a dog. I couldn't even walk out with him.
They emerge into a city whose face has already been altered, a grimace where once there was a smile. There are plumes of smoke and trenches being dug, long lines for supermarkets with empty shelves, and the chaos of frightened people still trying to leave. Lives, too, of course, are being altered. This is Kiev's largest children's hospital, already running out of baby food. Shelling has forced the most fragile of patients to make a difficult move to the basement. Some are immunocompromised, receiving cancer treatment, like this woman's 9-year-old child. We receive all the medicine we need, she says, though we're running out of food. Russian and Ukrainian negotiators met for talks on the Ukrainian-Belarusian border, a stab at a ceasefire. But even as they met, the air raid sirens howled in Kiev, and Russia's brutal offensive carried on here and in other parts of the country. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky delivered a message to the Russian soldiers carrying it out. Drop your weapons and leave, he said. Don't believe your commanders, don't believe your propagandists, but simply save your lives. Leave. As for Ukraine's fight, people are still signing up to join the war effort, Max Karmazin included.
I'm not really afraid. I believe the world is on our side, and, we were attacked.
Kiev is back under curfew again tonight, and there is more shelling. The talks today offered no promise of a ceasefire, but the two sides have reportedly at least agreed to meet again. Margaret Evans, CBC News, Kiev.
With no breakthrough in sight, more than 500,000 people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, have already fled to neighboring countries. But there are many more thousands still desperately trying to escape the conflict. Susan Ormiston is near the Ukraine border with Poland.
We're here in Ukraine, Western Ukraine, and this lineup of cars is people trying to get to the Polish border. It stretches down this way for at least 20 kilometers. We've talked to many people waiting in their cars. They've been sitting in their cars, sleeping in their cars, inching forward for 4 to 5 days. So you sleep for 10 minutes, then you have to move the car forward.
Да. Big car, stop. 10, 12 minutes.
It's terrible.
Catastrophe.
4 days ago, there were only 50,000 Ukrainians who had fled the country. Today, the UN Refugee Agency says it's 500,000, and they just keep coming. The stories here, people sleeping for 10 minutes, then inching up a little further. A woman told me it took 1 day to go 2 kilometers. Some of them are from Lviv, about 60 kilometers down this way, others from Kyiv. They've all been trying for days to flee the war, and they're desperate to go out. Most of them women and children, as men between ages 18 and 60 are to stay in Ukraine to help fight. This refugee crisis is growing by the day. Susan Ormiston, CBC News, near the Polish-Ukrainian border in Ukraine.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Canada will send more lethal weapons to Ukraine. And as Karina Roman explains, it's all with the goal of putting more pressure on the Kremlin and isolating it.
We will be supplying Ukraine with anti-tank weapons systems and upgraded ammunition.
That's in addition to previous shipments of lethal and non-lethal equipment. Trudeau says it's not meant to provoke Russia. whose president has put his nuclear weapons on alert.
We stand resolute and determined to demonstrate that you cannot violate 75 years of peace and stability in Europe and then turn around and expect to be able to benefit from, profit from, and enjoy the fruits of that stability and the growth that that stability brought us all.
And more financial sanctions are coming on top of the ones aimed at Russia's central bank and Vladimir Putin himself.
Dictators, very much including the Kremlin's tyrant, often fail to understand democracies. We can seem to them to be weak and divided compared to the servile conformity that they impose on their societies at the barrel of a gun. But our very openness to debate and dispute means that once we are agreed on a course of action, we are strong and we are united.
Joining that fight on Ukrainian soil is not in the cards for Canadian troops for now. Still, it is recognized that in the surrounding NATO countries,
we also stand ready, of course, with our NATO allies if there were to be a breach and an occasion to invoke Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states essentially that an attack on one is an attack on all.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine is creating a refugee crisis. Canada is expediting immigration applications and allowing Ukrainians already in Canada to stay longer, but it has not yet lifted the visa requirement for Ukrainians to come here. Karina Roman, CBC News, Ottawa.
Russia's assault on Ukraine is drawing more retaliation from Western countries. The government and the people are taking painful financial hits. As Briar Stewart explains, none of that seems to be deterring the Russian leader, though.
When President Putin spoke to some of his top officials, his fear over COVID kept them sitting a few meters apart. When it comes to the international community, he and Russia are much more isolated. He called the West an empire of lies, even as Russia buckles under layers of sanctions. On Monday, the ruble was in free fall, losing more than 30% of its value before rebounding slightly. To help soften the blow, Russia kept its stock exchange closed and hiked interest rates from 9.5% to 20%. Russian companies that export had to sell off 80% of their foreign currency revenues. And the long lines at ATMs continue. Our economic situation will get a lot worse. It's inevitable, this woman says, but it's still not comparable with the losses who are dying in their homes through the fault of our forces. And the economic pain is only part of it. Russia is increasingly sealed off. Dozens of countries, including Canada, have closed their airspace to Russian planes, and Russia has reciprocated, leading to widespread flight cancellations. Over the weekend, there were several anti-war protests across Russia. And today, some media sites were hacked to display this dissident message. In a few years, we will live like in North Korea. What is it for us to put Putin in textbooks? This is not our war.
That Russian public is extremely unhappy with their Master and Visa card not working, Apple Pay not working, not being able to travel abroad.
And that could just be the beginning of a new period of harsh isolation because President Putin isn't recoiling from the threat of new sanctions. In fact, the Ministry of Defense has confirmed that upon his orders, the nuclear missiles have now been put on alert. Briar Stewart, CBC News, near St. Petersburg.
There have been unprecedented efforts to isolate Moscow from the global community after Russia invaded Ukraine. For more on what is being done and the potential fallout, we're joined by Doug MacArthur, Professor Emeritus of SFU School of Public Policy. Doug, first of all, the international community going to extraordinary lengths to counter Russia. We've got Germany moving away from pacifist post-war positions, investing more in defense. Switzerland, a neutral country for decades now adopting sanctions. How significant are these changes?
Well, they're pretty significant. The expectations of what's going to happen when you have this kind of war can't be formulated totally ahead of time. So what we're seeing now is that Russia has been forced from just moving in and occupying some key strategic sites and hoping to be able to take over the government to all-out invasion. So we have an invasion on our hands. I don't think that was necessarily expected by Germany and Switzerland and some of these other countries you've mentioned, but they're all seeing that there's a real fight, that the Ukraine people and army is resisting. And so they're going to step up the pressure to try to make Russia pull back and perhaps seek some sort of resolution that ends the shooting and the fighting.
Now, Canada is sending more weapons, lethal weapons, ammunition to help Ukraine. What is the significance of our country's involvement in this conflict, at least so far?
Well, Canada has been instrumental along with the European countries you mentioned, that Canada's been instrumental in arguing that this needs to be a war on our side, an economic war. And that what's needed is to support people in Ukraine, but also to hurt Russia's economy. And so Canada's been a real leader, actually, along with UK and United States, a real leader in mapping out the kind of approach we're going to take, which is to try to destroy the Russian economy or undermine the Russian economy, make Putin have second thoughts about this, and at the same time provide some support based on need to the Ukraine people themselves.
Now, what about the fallout in terms of the impact that Russia, whether it's more disinformation or cyber attacks, what do you think it or the Western allies and Western nations need to be prepared for in case Russia decides to push back against them?
Yeah, I think, first of all, that we all need to be prepared for the fact that Russia entered this to win. They didn't anticipate as much resistance as they're getting, but now they are committing themselves to ever-increasing attacks using ever-increasing more powerful weapons. They intend to fight this through to the finish. They intend to destroy the government of Ukraine. So what we're seeing here is each side, the West and the EU, the European Union, now trying to figure out how to put pressure on Russia to stop it from achieving those goals. Keep it away from the cities, keep it away from occupying the main population centers. This is going to work itself out in the next 2 or 3 days, but I don't think we should underestimate the fact that Russia will continue to increase the commitment to all-out warfare as Putin really doesn't have an alternative to this. He started it thinking it's going to be easy, and he does not have another plan other than to win through an invasion.
Doug MacArthur, we appreciate your time and your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Images of the destruction and fear in Ukraine are spreading fast on social media. And for children, the situation may feel scary and very confusing. The CBC's Deanna Sumanak-Johnson shares advice from parents and experts on how to approach this difficult topic with kids.
Yes.
Sadaf Salim didn't want her kids, 9-year-old Ilyas and 11-year-old Aya, to hear about the war in Ukraine in the schoolyard, so she offered a preemptive chat.
I wanted them to feel safe. I wanted them to say, right now, there's no military act that Canada's doing, but I really want them to empathize because we have a very diverse school.
The plan that we're seeing is for something that could be really the biggest war in Europe since 1945.
With frightening images and words heard on the news or on social media.
This is threatening a World War III.
Teachers say they're already hearing that anxiety in their classrooms, hot on the heels of fears about COVID.
The questions I was receiving today are, are we in danger? Are we going to be bombed? What is NATO? Who are our allies? Right? So real solid questions.
I think younger students have had a relationship with this concept of global, panic, global dynamics, global pandemics, global death that maybe a lot of us didn't have to have.
What was your scariest moment in the war?
Experts who speak to children about war all the time, like veterans, say there are strategies parents and teachers can adopt, including giving context to the conflict in simple, clear terms, explaining what criteria Canada might consider in getting further involved, and refraining from demonizing whole nations.
I think this is for me, a very clear-cut incidence of a great evil and wrong being done by the invasion. But I mean, when you're talking about individual Russians, they will have many different opinions about this.
And carry the one.
For Sadaf Salim's kids, the knowledge that they're safe in Canada is, for now, enough, as parents field a new batch of tough questions without easy answers. Deanna Sumanek-Johnson, CBC News, Toronto.
A young BC woman who lost her spouse to flesh-eating disease is now suing Northern Health. As Rihanna Schmunk explains, she claims doctors misdiagnosed her partner's condition 3 times over several visits to the same emergency room.
The lawsuit takes you through 3 days of Josh Wakely's search for a diagnosis. He was a young dad, working as a welder up near Fort St. John. In February 2020, the claim says he developed a sore throat. Then came the back spasms, then a pain in his hand. He tried over and over to figure out what was wrong, but his spouse alleges the local hospital failed. Brittany Stewart claims Wakely went to the emergency room at Fort St. John Hospital 3 times in 3 days. Her BC Supreme Court lawsuit says multiple doctors diagnosed a range of illnesses but missed a Group A strep infection. It developed into necrotizing fasciitis, what's known as flesh-eating disease. Wakely died within days, leaving behind Stewart and their 2-year-old son.
It's been definitely the most difficult 2 years of our lives, that's for sure. Like, you don't think that you're going to be a single parent, and you definitely don't think you're going to be a single parent at like 30 years old. It's difficult because the one person that is going to make it all better is the one that is gone, and you can't talk to them anymore, and you just want a hug from that person. Like, Josh was my emotional support system. He was my rock. He was the one person that understood me.
Stewart is suing Northern Health and multiple doctors for negligence. She claims none of the physicians ordered lab work or a routine strep test, and she claims any of those could have diagnosed her spouse's infection. None of her claims have been proven in court, and none of the defendants have filed a response. CBC News contacted Northern Health, but they say they can't comment on an ongoing legal dispute. Rihanna Schmunk, CBC News, Vancouver.
The outlook continues to be dire, to say the least. The timeline to change ever narrowing. The new report on climate change and what might still be done. Our Johanna Wagstaffe will have more on that after this.
The United Way says housing prices in Vancouver are so high, many people are going hungry just to pay for a roof over their heads. Housing prices in the city have jumped 80% in less than 9 months, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to attract new homeowners to the West Coast. Colin Hoth reports.
This home, which 2 years ago sold for $75,000, is on the market today for $245,000. A one-bedroom apartment in this ordinary block priced at $97,000, twice what it was a year ago. Vancouver companies are finding it more difficult to woo executives here from other parts of the country because of the high cost of housing. But it's the young people out to buy their first home who are the hardest hit. John and Judy Thomason were forced to move 55 kilometers out of the city to find a home priced under $100,000. They finished up buying this 2-bedroom home for $95,000. Judy, a nurse, will have to work nights to help meet mortgage payments of almost $1,200 a month.
I make a pretty decent salary, and yet there's no way that we could buy this house without Judy going back to work.
I don't like being put in a position of almost desperation. We need, we have to buy a house to have some place to live. And, and for the next 5 years, our lifestyle was pretty good. And we lived quite high, and now we're not going to be able to.
Economist Professor Michael Goldberg forecasts that today's Vancouver prices will soon become regarded as the norm for growth areas in Canada.
And that can happen certainly in a place like Newfoundland. It can happen in Alberta, and I would foresee it happening in Alberta as soon as the constitutional issue is settled. And I could see it happening in Montreal and in Toronto. All we need is a sudden surge in demand and house prices take off.
The forces of supply and demand have now moderated the price spiral. There are more new homes being built, and demand has been slowed by the fact that so many young people are out of the market. Labour's current high wage demands are an attempt to get them back in. Colin Holt, CBC News, Vancouver.
Here are some of the stories we're following tonight for you on CBC Vancouver News. As some of Ukraine's most vulnerable try to survive Russia's brutal assault, negotiators on both sides meet today to try to agree to a ceasefire. Canada has pledged more lethal weapons to Ukraine, and President Volodymyr Zelensky is lifting the need for entry visas for any foreigner willing to join its defense legion and fight Russian troops.
Financially, I don't think that my son should suffer and not have his father.
The BC woman whose husband died from flesh-eating disease 2 years ago is now suing Northern Health. Brittany Stewart claims none of the doctors who saw her husband Josh in 3 visits to Fort St. John Hospital ordered tests that could have diagnosed the infection. He died within days, leaving behind Stewart and their young son. Northern Health has yet to comment.
A heat pump in every home is something that we should absolutely do and could reduce our natural gas use almost immediately. This is not complicated stuff, but it's stuff that you need the policies to work together to make it happen.
That's one idea to help reduce our emissions in BC amid another grim UN report on climate change. Global experts warn we are facing irreversible global catastrophes. But the report also suggests there is a small window to minimize and even reverse the impacts. More now on that big climate change report. As we heard earlier, it contains some information very difficult to digest, but it also leaves some room for hope. Johanna Wagstaffe joins us. Jo, you've been reading through this report. What stands out for you from a science perspective?
Well, Dan, the science of this report is impressive. You know, just a reminder of the magnitude of what is really our first global assessment on the impacts of climate change on life on Earth in 7 years. So over 300 scientists from around the world, including a huge Canadian contingency, looked at the latest science. And that was an extra year because of COVID. What's really unique about this report is they looked at the impact to life on Earth at different degrees of warming. That's a huge undertaking. They looked at every single piece of research, peer-reviewed research around the world, and were able to look at 1.5, 1.6, 1.7 degree warming, and then every single risk, and then how that risk changes according to how we adapt. So great example, wildfires here in British Columbia. What does that look like with 1.6, with 2 degrees warming? But then how does that risk change depending on how we adapt to it with our prescribed burning, how much money we put into it? So very detailed report. But Dan, ultimately, we know around the world, the most vulnerable will be hit the hardest. And the impact to human health, food shortages, water shortages, and obviously disease and things that we're seeing now expect to become much, much worse.
Jo, what reaction are you seeing from those in the science community beyond yourself?
There is a huge element of hope. I know that the first half really does sound dire and bleak. I also spoke to Simon Donner from UBC, one of the co-authors on the ocean systems. And here's what he said about what happens next. And this did give me hope.
These reports have a really key government role. This is an assessment done by the world's scientists at the behest of the world's governments. So they are asking for this, and they have approved it, which means all these governments, even the ones that sometimes say things that don't sound so great about climate change, they've agreed that this report is correct.
And now this document will become the backbone for policy moving forward. The final part of this assessment comes out in 1 month, Dan. That will be how to mitigate greenhouse gases. That's the only section that's been left out so far. And this all will be in place for the next talk in the fall. Basically in Glasgow, we said, come back in a year with stronger commitments, and this will be the backbone for those commitments.
Okay, good to know. Johanna Wagstaffe, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
If you're thinking of grabbing your passport and hitting the road, we have a few things you need to know. New travel rules in the pandemic era. That's next. And at 6:44, a live look at City Hall. Bit of rain out there, and guess what? More is coming. Johanna will be back with a warning after this.
I'm Jeremy Ratt. I'm half Indigenous and half white. Pieces is an all-new CBC British Columbia original podcast. This is a story of being stuck between two worlds, and not really fitting in with either of them.
So because I don't have darker skin or long brown hair, that therefore I was not Indigenous.
You don't have to be a residential school survivor yourself to be traumatized by residential school.
Pieces. Listen to it now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Meteorologist Johanna Wagstaffe joins us now with the forecast. Boy, we were back to familiar sounds and sights, Joe. Rain pattering on the roofs and the cars everywhere.
Even the smells of rain almost
smells pretty good.
It does, yes. Earthy, I think, was the general note this Monday across the South Coast. Southwesterly flow is back in business after a cold high pressure last week. We start this week off pretty soggy. Let me show you the current temperatures across the country, though. We are very mild across British Columbia, and that will be our story for the rest of the week. Many places hitting the double digits for the next at least 7+ days. That Arctic air mass still hanging on. You can see in the purple there towards northern Quebec and Labrador, -5 and through Toronto, and -12 tonight for Charlottetown and Halifax. So there's that southwesterly flow. We still have bands of rain moving across the south coast as we speak, but they are lightening. As I mentioned, the rainfall warning has ended for Metro Vancouver. We could see another 10 to 20 millimeters out towards the Fraser Valley. As I take you through tomorrow, notice we do get a bit of a break through parts of the day. I don't know if it'll be enough for full blue skies, but keep your eye. You might see a few blue sky patches out there, but showery for one more day. Look at the snowfall forecast across the interior tomorrow. We are getting a good dumping for our local mountains, coastal ranges, and the Rockies, and we do need it. We haven't seen a ton of snow at alpine level in the past few weeks. Kelowna, you'll see showers in the morning. I think for the most part, we're not really seeing that snow down to the valley floor, although Prince George picking up 5 centimeters. It is definitely snow up towards Peace, but Kelowna getting up to 11 by the afternoon, 11 towards Cranbrook. Most of the moisture happening in the morning. Okay, breaking our forecast down. Showers tomorrow. Look for a hint of blue sky. Pretty showery with some breaks the next few days. We have this general southwesterly flow, but I think we'll see more sun than we have at least to start the week. And look at this change. We'll see increasing sun as we head into a high pressure ridge for the second half of the week. By Friday into Saturday and Sunday, blue skies. We get to keep the mild temperatures, a rare combo this time of the year. But all in all, this is a very typical March pattern with that southwesterly flow coming in before a nice high pressure. Dan, if it hasn't felt like spring yet for you, this week is definitely a spring one for the start of March.
I think we'll enjoy that change. Thank you, Joe.
I think so too. You're welcome.
COVID-19 hospitalizations in BC are still pointing down for 3 weeks, but deaths are not. 50 fewer patients are in hospital since this weekend, now down to 549, and 11 fewer people are in critical care. But COVID-19 deaths are not slowing down. 22 more people have died over the past weekend. Total outbreaks are now at 28 after 2 facilities in Interior Health were added. Starting today, travelers entering Canada can now take the quicker and cheaper rapid antigen test rather than the PCR test. But as Sophia Harris tells us, some also want the remaining pre-arrival testing scrapped as the Omicron wave recedes.
Last fall, Ontario snowbirds Diane and David Fine flew to the U.S. by helicopter and shipped their RV because the land border was closed. Now that it has reopened, they can drive home from Arizona, but they still face a hurdle, getting a pre-entry COVID-19 test.
We have no idea what the lineups are going to be like trying to get the antigen test. Are they even be able to have enough of supply to supply all the snowbirds coming back?
Starting Monday, travelers entering Canada can opt to take an antigen instead of a PCR test. Antigen tests are typically cheaper and easier to get, but critics argue it's time to scrap the test requirement for fully vaccinated travelers.
We're obviously cautious, and they should trust us.
So it just feels like it's over the top.
On Friday, several border town mayors joined the debate, calling for Canada to drop all pre-entry testing for land border travelers, arguing it's hurting the already devastated tourism industry.
Travelers are a lot like water. They're going to take the path of least resistance, and that may very well continue to include bypassing Canada.
Several medical professionals also support dropping the pre-entry test.
We're not really adding much, it's adding a lot of extra complication. We're not going to be keeping Omicron out or any other variant for that matter.
But the federal government says the test stays in place for now as a precautionary measure.
We must continue to exercise prudence. Let me be clear, our fight against the virus is not over.
Ottawa says it may further ease travel rules if pandemic conditions continue to improve. That leaves the fines hopeful. The pre-entry test will be dropped by the time they drive home next month. Sophia Harris, CBC News, Vancouver.
An Olympic tribute made out of snow got a very special visit this past weekend. The inspirational guests for these kids are next.
After years of working towards the goal of building an emergency shelter, now it's open and already being used. The Labrador West Housing and Homeless Coalition opened this 3-bedroom shelter last month with provincial and federal funding.
Well, we have lots of friends who surf on people's couches, who come in, and we have a lot of people in Labrador West who are living with aged parents who come back to town for many different reasons, you know, down on their luck.
Corrine says many don't realize that a wealthy region like Western Labrador deals with homelessness, but the boom-bust cycle has led to unstable housing. She sees people struggle to afford rent and find places to live.
I've lived here for 49 years. It's a very affluent community, lots of money, but doesn't come without its social issues, you know, from addictions to mental illness, to people with complex needs, to family circumstances. So we have a lot of hidden homelessness in Labrador West.
Corrine sees this shelter as a stopgap measure to help those in need.
You know, the request came in for $185,000 for 3 rooms, this space that we're in today, for people that find themselves in a very difficult spot that really don't have anywhere else to turn.
This particular shelter offers is support. So it's not just a housing unit, it is also support to help them move on to long-term and stable housing in the future.
It's not just providing a temporary place to stay. Shelter support staff help the residents find permanent housing and help people look for jobs and other social services. The shelter is the second project for the Homeless Coalition in the decade it's been operating.
Actually, yes, we opened a 10-unit apartment building called the Courtyard Place, which was for low-income families, and very successful and very vibrant, and actually apartments full since we opened it.
The coalition only has funding for this place for 1 year, but hopes that with the facility now open, it'll get more funding to keep it going. Daryl Din, CBC News, Labrador City.
Hi, I'm Amy Bell. Here's what's in your CBC Vancouver inbox.
On March 10th, join CBC British Columbia's Michelle Elliott and inspirational female entrepreneurs at the Surrey Board of Trade's Entrepreneur Showcase. Register for the discussion today at businessinsurrey.com and never miss a special programming series or contest. Subscribe to CBC Vancouver's e-newsletter at cbc.ca/Vancouver inbox and keep connected with us.
A pair of Olympic bobsledders made a surprise visit to some kids over the weekend. This after a bunch of friends built a bobsled out of snow.
When we watched bobsled, we were thinking that it was really fun, so we decided to do a bobsled too.
They were inspired by Canada's Olympic team, and video of the kids performing the drills ended up being shared widely on social media, naturally. Corey Sorensen and Mike Evelyn then popped by yesterday to take a look. The duo was part of Canada's 4-man bobsled team that finished 9th in Beijing. The snow bobsled was constructed in front of Sorensen's childhood home.
I think it's amazing. Like it's accurate. The colors are like spot on, and it's a little big actually. Maybe not exactly to scale, but awesome job though.
This is what it's all about. I mean, the reason we dream about, being on the big stage is so we can inspire the next generation, and to see this right in our own backyard is the coolest thing in the world.
Good on those kids. Thanks for being with us tonight on CBC Vancouver News at 6. You can watch this program on CBC Gem, our free app. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and our website, cbc.ca/BC. I will have your next local news at 11 o'clock, right after the National. Thanks for watching. Good night.